Hi, everybody. This is Kathy L. Murphy, the Pulpit Queen, and I'm reporting live from a little cabin in the woods, Murphy's Law. And I'm here with some of my bestest friends, my authors that are here, that are going to be introduced by Eileen Sanchez, who is the creator of Prose and the Pandemic. And her book, Freedom Lessons, was also an official Pulpit Queen pick. So to give her all the time to showcase her authors, Eileen, I'm passing it all over to you. Okay?
Okay. Thank you, Kathy. So we are honored to be here as Pulpwood Queens and grateful for the team behind this week-long event. Kathy L. Murphy, CEO and founder, Paul Roberson, webmaster, Robert Gwaltney, co-host, and Mandy Haynes, executive director. Our panel's title is Books as Bridges: How Story Connects, Heals, and Guides Us. And we believe that reading books show the many facets of the human condition. Books enrich, enlighten, and engage us. Most of all, books teach us compassion for others. My sister Pulpwood Queen authors, Kathy Ramsberger, Deborah Thomas, Anju Gattani, is her little chapter is in this book, and myself. And I'll introduce each of them, they're going to introduce themselves, and we're going to share inspiration for our stories. But for me, thank you, Kathy, for recognizing that it's part of Prose and the Pandemic team. I'm retired after a 40-year career in education. I started as a teacher and ended as a district administrator. But Freedom Lessons is my first novel of my avocation as an author. Freedom Lessons begins in Louisiana, 1969, as Colleen, a white Northern teacher, enters into the unfamiliar culture of a small Southern town and its unwritten rules as the town surrenders to mandated school integration. The reader meets Frank, a Black high school football player who is protecting his family with a secret, and Evelyn, an experienced teacher and a prominent member of the local Black community, who must decide whether she's willing to place her trust in her new white colleague. It's a snapshot of history through the eyes of characters living their lives and navigating relationships against the backdrop of extreme societal upheaval. It's a story not just about segregation as an abstract concept, but about the people who lived it, and asks us to question our assumptions about that time. It's told alternately by Colleen, Frank, and Evelyn. Freedom Lessons is the story of how the lives of these three purportedly different people intersect in a time when our nation faced, as it does today, a crisis of race, unity, and identity. And now I'm going to turn over to Kathy Ramsberger, and she'll tell you about herself and her book. Kathy.
Thank you so much, Eileen. I'm so honored to be here today with these three amazing authors who write about complex social issues like me. So I'm a journalist. I'm a short story writer turned international humanitarian for 20 years, who's returned to what she's loved best from college onwards, writing novels and helping writers get over hurdles with my Step Into Your Story method and my show Story Hour. So I thought I'd keep writing when I was still overseas, my whimsical, amusing short stories that were more like fairy tales and some essays, because I was writing other people's stories for a long time. For instance, one was a fairy tale about a troll who lived behind a dressing room mirror and whispered evil nothings into women's ears who were trying on swimsuits. But 9/11 changed all that. Now I write about all five facets of unconditional love. My novel, The Shores of Our Souls, is about love in the midst of war and the conflict inherent in all relationships. It's told in 2 points of view, in Manhattan, North Carolina, and Beirut. It's about a love against all impossible odds and the struggles bicultural and biracial couples faced in the early 80s and still face. Kasim is a UN diplomat, Muslim, and Lebanese. Diana is a young woman from the American South who researches at the Met. Whether or not they stay together, their love changes them and leads them to new lives. And I've explored Diana's path as a result of their meeting in my sequel, A Thousand Flying Things, due out late this year. Love between cultures and religions is never easy, but get a glimpse of a time in history when it was nearly forbidden. If you like star-crossed chemistry, accurate historical detail, and tales of redemption, I think you'll enjoy Shores. So, Debbie, I think you're next. I've loved reading Loose, and I want to congratulate you on all. I saw your post today, and I saw all the medals it's gotten, including the Sarton Award. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Oh, thank you so much, Kathy. Well, yes, I'm Deborah Thomas, and I'm the author of Loose, which was a bonus book for the Pulpwood Queens this past year, which was quite an honor. Thank you so much, Kathy. That meant the world to me. Originally, I'm from upstate New York, Binghamton, New York, but I've lived in Southern California most of my adult life. I came here in my early 20s. I taught English in high school, LAUSD Public High School. Most of my students were Latinx. Their families from Mexico and Central America. And most importantly, I taught English as a second language to adults. I've done this off and on for quite a few years. And all of this led me to become an immigrant and refugee rights activist. And that's what led me to write Loose. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But Luz, which means light in Spanish, is about a young Mexican girl named Alma and the journey that she takes to try to find her missing father. Now, her father was a migrant farm worker who worked the farms in the US, and he had done this for decades since he was a teenager. But in 1997, he disappears, and Alma and her sister Rosa decide to travel the length of Mexico, try to cross the border to see what she can find out about her father. And as with all journey stories, they meet many characters along the way. She meets a young man named Manuel that she will fall in love with, so there's a love story. They will come across very kind and generous people who will help them, but they will also encounter profound cruelty. Ultimately, Loose is the story of a young woman's journey to love, light, and hope. And now we're going to hear from Anju Gattani.
Thanks so much, Deborah. And, you talk about immigration. I'm coming from the other end of the spectrum. We left everything that we knew in our world in Asia back just prior to 9/11. So we landed in New Jersey shortly after 9/11, and it was really not the best time to be here. But here we were with my husband and myself, our 2 boys, 4 suitcases and 8 boxes. That was our world. And that's how we began our journey as immigrants here. And my career as an international freelance journalist for lifestyle publications that I was writing for in Hong Kong, India, Singapore, that all came to an end because the magazines back then didn't have the online presence they do have now. So I'm originally from Hong Kong. I grew up under an umbrella of the most diverse and cultural strata in society that you could find, 36 nationalities under our school roof alone. What a privilege. And what an even bigger privilege to be, to have my book one in the Winds of Fire series picked by Kathy Murphy as an international Pulpwood Queen pick. After the journey that I've gone through to get the icing on the tiara or the diamond on the tiara, it's all validating. Especially, it's funny because I began to get published, and I was first published when I was 9, but not in the written word, it was in a drawing. So if you think I'm an artist, no, the best I can do are stick figures. I'm great at that. But when I tell my stories, I have learned that the characters tell the stories. I'm simply the vehicle that bleeds on the page. My first drafts are always pen on paper. So, given that's my little history, we now live in Atlanta, Georgia, my husband, my 2 sons, and our little rabbit Momo. But I've also lived in Singapore, India, Hong Kong, Australia, and within the US, New Jersey, Connecticut, and here we are in Atlanta. So the Winds of Fire series is the story of a modern young Indian woman, Sheetal, and the twist of fate when she surrenders her true love and personal honor to marry a playboy millionaire and preserve the family honor. The man has been chosen for by her family, her parents, and she has no choice. She has to surrender and give in, or she will be outcasted. Sheetal finds that she's trapped in a web of lies, deceit, betrayal. Nothing is as she was promised by her parents. The next thing, she finds herself pregnant. She has no place to go. She learns to assert her independence, to stand up for herself. But the bigger struggles, which many, many women face today in any and every part of Asia, are to break free of the culture, tradition, and the abuse and domestic violence that all these practices also enforce as a byproduct. But now she also has to protect her son. And that journey spans across the globe, generations of patriarchy, and of course, huge cultural divides. The Winds of Fire series stands up for victims of domestic violence, abuse, and advocates for mental health, immigration, and most of all, it gave me, because I learned from my character, the gift of self-empowerment. Over to you, Eileen.
Thank you. I'm buffering a little bit. I don't know if anyone else is, so I just asked my husband if he could like shut his off. We'll see. So we, four authors, have written stories of the human struggle to find home, fit in, and be free, to be who we are and live our truth. And we hope our stories can bridge the gap differences, enabling conversations that support understanding. As you listen, if you have a question, please type it into the chat box, and we hope to have a time for a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to turn it back over to Kathy, and she's going to tell us the kinds of things that inspired her and how she hopes to connect with readers for these healing and guiding opportunities. Kathy?
Thanks so much, Eileen. So when I was in my early 20s at National Geographic, I fell in love with a man from Beirut who worked at the World Bank. We stayed together for a while. We loved each other very much. And then we parted. When 9/11 happened 2 decades later, and there were fighter planes flying over my children's playground as I rushed to get them after the Pentagon was bombed, which is about 20 minutes from my house. So low, so close. I could see the pilots' faces, and I knew that fear was going to catch on in our country at that point because I was viscerally afraid myself. And I, as a humanitarian, I knew that the brunt of that fear and anger would turn toward Arabs and Arab Americans. As a humanitarian journalist, especially during my years overseas working for the International Red Cross and Red Crescent, I'd interviewed refugees and immigrants. I knew the world didn't understand who these people were. I wanted to write about a real person, not a terrorist, real love, not a stereotype. We see the lines of people on the border or in a refugee camp in 15-minute time slots on the news. And some viewers make assumptions without knowing these immigrants as people. They see the line, the stream, the crowd, and not the individuals. I wanted to change that. I've spent 2 decades talking to people who've lost everything to extreme poverty, famine, war, people who've lost their homes, their health, their children, everything. I wanted to tell their stories. There's a reason that a bridge appears on my book cover, and thank you, Kathleen Rogers, for calling me this morning and saying, yeah, there's a bridge on your cover. It's true. Love is what bridges division. It's what binds us together, and it's the solution. That's why I made my book a love story. Too many stories are written about cultures in terms of conflict, especially since 9/11. But it's happened in every previous war our country's engaged in. I come from a military family, 2 World War II vets, But there's too much written about terrorism and hatred, our differences, and not nearly enough published about finding out our similarities and learning to love our differences, not our similarities. So love, unconditional love, not romantic love, lasts and it transforms. Love's the only thing that heals. So I took my memories of love and wrote a novel. The novel is pure fiction. The plot is totally from here, my imagination, but the love, it's real. The results have been phenomenal, more than I could have dreamed of. I would have never produced Story Hour if it hadn't been for this book and the pandemic that stopped my friends' book tours in their tracks. It's also healed many people who had to leave a love because it wasn't accepted yet, who had to choose between family, culture, country, or their own union. I hear these stories in the book clubs I visit. It's provoked a change of thought when people read it. One of my first bloggers was Mad Book Love. When I saw the review, I was first excited and then I was bummed because it wasn't 5 stars. It was close, but it wasn't 5 until I read the review. It was a lengthy review where she was debating herself about her beliefs, about what a book should be and about how the world should be. And she ended with all of the places this book took me and all the feelings I had to sort through, there wasn't a way to communicate how I felt about the book in a few paragraphs. I grew from it in a really meaningful way, and I believe it will be one of those books that will leave a permanent mark. I'll remember it for the rest of my life. I've gotten mostly 5 stars since then, but hers is the one that will have a lasting impact on me. I've healed people from other countries with my book. I know that for sure because they tell me in book clubs. Up until this year, I donated a portion of my proceeds to Syrian children who've lost their parents in war. Since the explosion in Beirut's port, this has gotten worse. Did you know 80% of Syrian children, a very literate country, cannot finish school either because the schools are closed due to the pandemic or danger or having to support their families? So the book lives on, not just in its message, but in helping children. I'm asked about effecting change and legacy at these book clubs. Who can know the longevity of a book? Did Shakespeare know we'd be performing his plays today? Did Sophocles? Did Eudora Welty when this young woman was sitting and listening to her read? Did Khalil Gibran know his words would resonate with a young teenager in 1972 and it would influence her to write a love story about an Arab and an American reminiscent of his relationship with Mary Haskell? And I title it The Shores of Our Souls, which is a hat tip to the prophet. Books do leave legacies. Words bridge time, space, and continents and cultures. Words have power, the power of love to change the world. And now, here is Debbie, who is doing just that with her book Loose.
Oh, Kathy, thank you. Oh, what beautiful words you spoke about love. That is so true. That's why I chose for my epigraph for my novel, Martin Luther King's quote, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." And certainly my character's love for her father, her sister, her boyfriend, her daughter, Luce. When I first started writing, I wanted to do 2 things. I wanted to tell a universal story about the journey that we all take to find out where we fit in, where we belong, what is home, where can we live our truth. But I also wanted to tell Alma's story because I wanted to build a bridge of empathy and understanding involving the topic of immigration. As I pointed out, Luce came from my experiences as a teacher and an immigrant rights activist. And this began way back in the mid to late 90s, probably even the 80s, but the 90s were when it's when I was teaching English as a second language to adults. many of them from Mexico and Central America. And I was hearing about what their lives were like in their home country, why they were forced to leave, and no one leaves their home because they want to. There's always a forceful reason. I learned what their journeys were like, what it was like once they got here, which was not necessarily easy. And at the same time, and this was in the 90s, I was reading about the deaths in the desert in the LA Times every day. Now, this had happened at that time because the Mexican economy had plummeted, the peso was devalued, and many people were coming from Mexico across our border. Now we hear Honduras and Haiti. In the 80s, it was the civil wars in Central America. But at this particular time, it was many people from Mexico. And so our government responded, hoping to deter the migration and by putting up more fences, high-tech lighting, underground sensors, and it did not deter them. It pushed them further east through the deserts, and that's why they were dying. So I was so moved, I became involved in Amnesty International in their immigrant and refugee rights panel. And I was able to tour a detention center, which is just like a prison. I went to both sides of the border, spoke with people in shelters, border patrol, poor communities. It was quite an eye-opening experience. At the same time, I met Father Richard Estrada here in Los Angeles, and he was involved in a group called Water Stations Project, which is now called Border Angels, and they're very active. These are volunteers who go out into the desert and they leave water marked by blue flags in the hopes of preventing the death from dehydration. While I was having these experiences, there was also increasing anti-immigrant sentiment across our country. Even my own family and some friends would debate with me about it. And I knew it was because they really didn't know the details. And I thought, I want to write about this. And I want to do it through fiction, because I believe, many of you hear me say this, I believe that it's through fiction that we draw the reader in to experience another life, to see through their eyes, to walk in their skin, like Atticus Finch says. And I hoped that if I told Alma's story, that maybe if it would be personal and intimate, maybe the reader would be drawn in and see why and how and what it was like, and hopefully increase empathy and understanding. So obviously I hoped to build a bridge, especially with those unfamiliar with the details. So it's been a year and a half. My book came out in June 2020. I had no idea. It was my first novel. I had no idea what would happen. And as Kathy pointed out, I was so fortunate to win awards. The Sarton Award was so thrilling to me, because May Sarton has been a huge inspiration and influence in my life. I was the bonus book pick, which was a thrill. But it was reader responses, of course, as all of you authors know, that were the most moving. And I was thrilled to see that many people in all corners of our country, from rural areas, Montana, small towns, were telling me, oh my gosh, I had no idea that's what it was really like. One woman wrote, "This novel gave me more of an insight about how immigrants risk their lives to get to the US. Being from the Northeast of the US, we really do not experience or think about these immigrant communities and what they have to endure throughout their lives. This book was an eye-opener." Words like that really meant the world to me. But I was thrilled when I saw that I built a bridge between a Latina mother and daughter. A young woman wrote to me saying that when she first started reading Luce, she was skeptical. She thought, what would I know about that? What perspective could I possibly have? But she got caught up in the story and began to identify with Luce, the daughter, and saw her mother as Alma. And when she was finished, she had a conversation with her mother that she had never had before. And she found out about her mother's journey from El Salvador, which means she had to come through Central America, length of Mexico, try to cross the border. And her mother told her that at one point she and her sister got lost in the desert for several days, that she collapsed and hit her head on a cactus. Anyway, the young woman said she would never have had this conversation if she hadn't read Luce, and that it opened her eyes to what her mother had been through and renewed her admiration and respect for her mother. So that it was a bridge for that mother and daughter was an absolute thrill for me. So I would like to thank Eileen and Kathy and Anju for including me on this panel. These novels are all amazing, promoting intercultural communication and understanding. And now let's hear from Anju Gattani.
Thank you, Deborah. You know, you just raised an issue which we still ask ourselves today, because we migrated all the way from Asia to here. You know, I left Hong Kong and then I moved to India and then Singapore with my husband and then now here. And we always ask ourselves, it's a huge journey. Is it worth it? And now 20 years later, we ask ourselves, was it worth it? Not that, you know, we endured anything horrific, but there's just such a transition in our lives, and our children, who are now first generation Americans almost, we have issues that we have to try and explain to them in terms of the cultural divides and differences of where we're coming from and where they are right now at their stages in life. So, you know, the Winds of Fire series, I didn't ask for the series, it came to me. And when it came to me, it was in the form of a daydream, just before I had to pick up my then 5-year-old from the bus stop. And he's now 25 and a half, so 20-year journey, here we are. And I didn't understand who these characters were, why are they running, who are they running away from? And I just knew that if they didn't run and break free, the end result was ultimate death. So the journey began with a search for going backward to who are the characters, what's their story, all the questions we ask as journalists, you know, who, what, when, why, where. And of course, I had no answers. And I wasn't even sure whether I could take on a project of this scale, because I'd been published in short fiction, and travel, tourism, feature fiction articles, all of that. I'd made the front page cover of magazines and stuff, but this was new. It didn't make any sense. So of course, that's when you turn to people you trust, like your mom and your husband, and you kind of ask them, am I sane? You know, because I couldn't shake this dream off and I didn't know what it was. Well, sure enough, it turns out now, 20 years later, it is now that scene which belongs at the end of book 2 in the series. And at that time, I wrote the manuscript. It took me a year and a half to pound out the original with the sequel in my head, which is book 3. There are books ahead, and there's a prequel, which I now see. So it's really confusing and daunting for me in terms of where the story came from. So I'll just be honest and say I'm only a vehicle and nothing more. The words on paper are my jewels. And the way I see the impact that it's had is I was just trying my best to tell the story I knew in the best way I knew how. And that's when New York Times bestselling author Haywood Smith took me under her wing and said, honey, you need to learn how to write. And I'm like, teach me. She took me under her wing. USA Today bestselling author Jade Lee took me under her wing. And both women taught me what it is to be a professional author and how to write fiction for the American market, which was a huge learning curve and enormous rewrites of the 2 books, over 500 rejections. Nobody wanted the book. No publisher knew what to do with it. And I continued with those rejections, and I didn't give up because I knew that the story was given to me for a reason. So just very humbly, that's what all I was trying to do, tell the best story I knew in the best way I knew how. And of course, when book 1 came out in 2020, it was optioned for screen, adaptation to film to double strings, which was a complete surprise, not expected. And after that, Kathy Murphy, an international book pick. I mean, you know, the story that nobody wanted, suddenly there were people out there who understood what I was trying to say and what characters were trying to say. And then I got blurbs from such wonderful people like booksbywomen.org, who said it's like a Downton Abbey style saga, but set in India. Someone else compared it to Crazy Rich Asians set in India. And I was just baffled at the reaction because, you know, for so long I was told thanks, but no thanks. So these are some of the most powerful feedbacks that you get, where you have to learn more than anything to trust your own gut instinct, as opposed to what everyone else is trying to tell you. And I think the power of the book and the bridge for readers was twofold for me, completely shocking and unexpected. One was an American friend of mine who is a therapist, and we met recently, and she said, you know, your book helped me. And I'm like, how? She explained that she was counseling a young Indian woman who has not first generation parents, but immigrant parents. And the young girl was facing a lot of issues in terms of cultural divides, lack of comprehension between her world and her parents' world. So when my friend, the therapist, read my book, she understood where this 20-year-old was coming from in terms of what her parents had dealt with, wanted to impose on her, and how she was struggling to fight back. And that was a complete surprise. But the bigger surprise to all of you, and I'm not a licensed therapist, I'm not a licensed psychologist, was in a recent trip to India this year, when one of my very, very close, I would say a cousin sister, let's put it that way, I found out she had been in an abusive marriage for about 10 to 15 years, but it was all kept undercover. And it's gone into the legal route. And she was told to seek a psychologist or a therapist for counseling. And the therapist told her, go back to your husband. This is despite torture, trauma, and everything that she's dealt with, including physical abuse. It's gone to that extent. I listened to her story, and again, I'm not licensed in any form, but when I sat down with her, because I had done all the research and because I've worked with American psychologists and therapists, I was able to guide and navigate her to heal and to come out of the self-blame process of blaming herself as a victim for everything that she had endured, and being able to break and live free so that she was able to, after 13 years, look this man in the eye who's taken one of her 2 children and walk past him without living in fear. That is, I think, the biggest gift that my characters and my stories have taught me in terms of when I say the gift of self-empowerment. I expected nothing. I just wanted to tell a story, and I look at what I've learned and how I'm able to, in my own little way, just help other people bridge their issues through words on paper. Because as you said, Debbie and Kathy and Eileen, there is nothing more powerful in this world than the words we put on paper and share with the world.
Thank you, Anju. Thank you. This is really, just being on this panel is such a privilege. And I have read Luz, and I'm in the middle of Kathy's book, and Anju, we can't wait to get yours. I've read the chapter in the work in progress, and it's just amazing, these connections and the stories that come from experience or from just something that has caught you and driven you to write these words. And so the stories that we tell ourselves and others define us. I never expected to write a novel, but the process has changed me and frankly helped me to heal. I was a witness and helpless to change the events. Writing gave me a voice. Freedom Lessons is based on my experience as a young teacher, a New Jersey girl transplanted to the South for 1 year. I rarely spoke of that year. It was hard to explain. I buried it. More than 10 years ago, I did tell a group of friends, and one of them challenged me to write about it for my 2-year-old biracial granddaughter. It was to be a memoir for our daughters and grandchildren. That granddaughter is now 17 and wrote a blurb that is inside the book. Writing it as a memoir proved harder than I expected. Without a journal or diary, memory wasn't enough. I started to research and realized that there was a huge part of that time I didn't understand. I found a dissertation titled "Even the Books Were Separate" by Dr. Gary Clark, which included interviews of 6 educators, and their stories bridged that time for me. It took 40 years for me to really understand what is called the crossover in Louisiana. Many Black teachers had to deal with transfers to unwelcoming schools and the loss of their own classroom. I witnessed that. The impact was most significant for high school students who lost sports and student council leadership positions, their high school prom, and even the opportunity to graduate. Some school districts planned better than the one that I worked in. My website has some examples and background for anyone that's interested in learning more. I reached out and finally met and interviewed Dr. Gary Clark, and through him, I was introduced to Dr. Hicks, a native of Shreveport, Louisiana, and the only Black male professor at Centenary College in Shreveport. Dr. Hicks was planning a 50th anniversary commemoration of the crossover in 2019. And he was interested in reading my manuscript. So I sent it to him. And weeks later, I didn't expect to hear from him, but it was a hot August afternoon and Michael called my cell phone as I was parking in the Costco lot. I wasn't prepared to hear him call. I was very nervous and then just shocked with his comments. We spoke for an hour. He was full of the types of compliments that any author wishes they could hear. Freedom Lessons had resonated with this 50-something Black man, born and raised in Louisiana just at the time of the story. And then he wrote this blurb for my book. Reading this book has changed me personally and professionally. The Deep South no doubt plays its role. The further you read in the story, the more hot and humid it starts to feel around you. The author succeeds where historians and academics like myself fail, recounting major societal events through the inescapable and complex humanity of her characters. The story fully delivers on the challenge of framing what teaching and learning was during this era, and Freedom Lessons forces us to ask the question of what it should be now. Dr. Hicks also used Freedom Lessons as a required reading for his classes and invited me to fly down to Louisiana to speak to them. I was thrilled. I just couldn't believe that this was happening. And then 2 classes filled with 18 and 19-year-old students who didn't know that 50 years earlier, freedom of choice was the preferred law of the land, not Brown versus the Board of Ed. Reading my fictionalized version of the crossover helped them to recognize prejudice in their own families, to have conversations with each other and with me. I was also asked to speak at a public event when I was there, and the event was called Crossing Over, Race in Education. And that evening, I met adults who had been high school seniors in 1969 and had faced the challenges that my character, Frank, experienced. The loss of leadership, the resistance to their potential, and the opportunity to have their prom. And I have to add, like Debbie had said, that there was some resistance to how I would be telling their story. But when they heard me speak and realized that I had been part of it, they really came around, and it was just such a good opportunity to have real conversations. So Michael Hicks and I have built a bridge from New Jersey to Louisiana. We were also able to share our experiences at an event sponsored by my alumni. I'm an alumnus of Rutgers University Graduate School of Education, and they sponsored a talk called The Crossover School Integration, a conversation started 50 years ago. And there's a link that I can send if anybody wants to hear Michael and I have this conversation. My meeting Gary Clark and Michael Hicks and many more people that when I went back to do some interviews in Louisiana, facilitated intercultural understanding, and the conversations continue with the opportunity to speak to you today. I'd like to add one more example of how Freedom Lessons served as a bridge of healing for a reader. Readers are always asking me which parts of the story are true, but I was never expecting this question. A minor character is named Cynthia. Cynthia is a second grader who didn't read well at the start of the story, but grew to love reading by the end. I was a guest at a book club, and one of the members asked me if Cynthia was real and if she was based on a child in my class. When I said yes, that Cynthia was real, the woman burst into tears. And so did I when she told me her story. She couldn't read in second grade. She felt ashamed and incompetent until she had a teacher that helped her to learn to read and taught her to love books. So we have a fictionalized, but based on a real 7-year-old Black child and a woman in her 60s. They connected through this book. Books are bridges, and they are stories that connect, heal, and guide us. And that's the end of our presentation for you. But if there are any questions or comments, we'd love to have a chance to answer them.
We have about 5 minutes.
Okay.
So raise your hand if you have a question. I'm opening it up so everybody can see. Yes, Ruthie.
So, what does it feel like to be in the midst of our country right now, where we're sliding back, where voters' rights are being taken away, where progress that's been made isn't moving forward, is sliding backwards? I know for me, it's a heartache. And I wonder, as writers, you're both writers and activists, it seems to me, but you're activists, in stories. What can be done? How can we help?
Words, Ruthie, words.
Yeah.
Speaking up, speaking our truth. There's one thing that I didn't get to put in, and there's a gentleman who invited me to speak to his group. He's of the Baha'i faith. He's an immigrant. He became a citizen in '85. He teaches business ethics at University of Cincinnati. And at the end of my talk, he said, "One enemy is too many." And then he was silent for like a full minute. And then he turned to me and said, and he's done a lot of prejudice in his life, "You can't paint through the rust because it'll just come back. You've got to find a solution." And then he said to me, "Your book is part of that solution, Kathy."
Oh,
Those words affected my heart in a way that nobody's ever said anything like that to me before. So I knew I was on the right track. And so are you, Ruthie. You're writing your books, you're speaking your truth, and you're changing the world with them. It gives us hope.
Yeah, I have to say, I know this is going to be a tough couple years ahead for us, right? And I live by this, it's better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. And when I get angry, when I get frustrated, I try to stay focused on that. And I heard a very wise woman say, "Fight the ignorance, not the individual." And so work on educating, work on, trying to get people to understand the real truth, the real news.
Well, and I could add, I have a saying that each one teach one, each one reach one. If everyone we just have to keep sharing, and it goes back to Anju's persistence in getting her story written, to get it published. It's true for me as well. I never intended to tell the story. I felt I was so helpless as a 22-year-old teacher. How I couldn't do anything. Well, now I've touched some people that have never knew the history of that time. You know about it, but you don't really know. You have to really walk in another person's shoes. So, Ruthie, I really feel that pain, the frustration of it. When I wrote this, my book was published in 2019, before this most recent reemergence of the challenges we have in this country with Black Lives Matter during the pandemic. So I thought that my book might help, and then that happened. And so I just think we have to just keep sharing and talking, and opportunities like today help us to share the message and to share the truth, to share the words.
Thank you, Eileen. What a wonderful panel, and building bridges. That's the theme for our Girlfriend Weekend this year. And that's what I've always tried to do in selecting the books. And now with the help of Mandy Haynes, I think we have a pretty amazing list of authors today. And I know that if we can share all of our stories, each of us share everybody's, we can make a difference. That's what it begins with, one person at a time, one book at a time, and just keep diligent, keep your diligence. So we've got to go. We'll continue this at our happy hours if we want to talk about more things, but we have another panel in 15 minutes, y'all. So take a little break and we'll be back on the hour. Thank you all so
Kathy.
much.
Great.
Awesome panel. And I love the subject. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay.